Welcome to part 2. So far we've looked at recognising stress and measures we can take to avoid it. But now Dr. Lockley turns his attention to coping with stress.
How do you cope with stress? Firstly, be reasonable with yourself. Jesus was reasonable with himself. He knew when to stop. There are a number of quotations in the Bible where Jesus clearly sees that there is a need, but chooses to go away to a quiet place to pray. The need is not the call, and it is not necessarily your call. There's huge need in the world. It may not be you that has to face it and deal with it. Be reasonable with yourself. 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work, and on the seventh thou shalt have a bean feast, is roughly what the Bible says about the use of our time and the Sabbath. Avoid perfectionism. It's very easy to get into the habit of trying to be perfect. We can't. We can do what we can. We need a certain amount of wisdom to allow us not to go too far beyond it. It's very easy to try too hard. There's a very important verse here from the Bible. Be ye perfect as I am perfect, says the Lord. And that drives a lot of Christians to utter distraction. But it doesn't quite mean what we think it means, because we use the word perfect in a slightly, subtly different way. It's much better to use the word complete. And then instead of it being a curse in our own perception, it becomes a blessing. Be complete as I am complete, says the Lord. Doesn't that have a different ring to it? You're not trying any longer. You're not trying to be good off your own bat. You're falling into completeness. The completeness that God has made and God has for you. Another technique for coping with stress. Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic. If you panic, you add to your stress. You have to think of Corporal Jones at this moment, of course. Who obviously, in saying don't panic, rushes round panicking everybody, including himself, and adding to the confusion and the mess. If you've got a problem, face it. Don't put it off. Or rather, don't put it off inappropriately. There's a time and a place for everything, and sometimes it's wise to just take things and put them on one side and deal with them when you have time and emotional energy and support and friends. Know your own stress symptoms. If you know that there are certain things that you can see happening in yourself that indicate that you are stressed, then it is important that when you see them happening, you think to yourself, hang on a minute, something's going on here. And Adrian Plass was saying about throwing things away, litter. He'd never do that normally. And then, you know, if he catches himself doing that in the future, I think he'll think, hang on a minute, what am I doing? How much are people asking me to do? How much am I allowing people to ask me to do things? Talk problems through, don't bottle them up. Very important. A trouble shared is a trouble halved. And sometimes, again, this is back to the perception business, and it's like the cognitive therapy. The ability to talk with somebody who is able to turn around and say to you, you haven't thought this through properly. What about such and such? Or why don't you think such and such? And you think, hey, got a point there. Never realised that. And suddenly the problem that you thought you had is actually not a problem at all. You can cope with stress by preparing properly. If you know what you are doing, then that gets rid of a lot of stress. The person who hasn't prepared properly is going to be the one who's going to be more stressed by exams. But not just exams, by everything in life and work, and at the church. If you have a sermon to deliver and you haven't done your homework and you can't remember the quotations, you'll get stressed. If you have an address to deliver and you haven't really learned it in your own mind, you'll get stressed. Exercise is a very good antidote to stress. What happens in stress is that we release adrenaline. We have a thing called the fight and flight reaction, where if we have something that is a problem to us, we gear ourselves up either to fight it or to run away. Now, that's what the animals do. They release lots of adrenaline. That adrenaline does a lot of things like tensing up the muscles, making us evacuate the bladder so that we're light and ready to run away, making us very alert so that we can see threats, and then we're ready to either to run off into the far distance or else stand and fight our ground. If you run away or fight, then that gets rid of the adrenaline because it uses it up. Okay? Great. So the adrenaline goes away, and then the muscle tension goes, and the sense of needing to go to the toilet goes, and the over-alertness drops, and everything goes back to normal. The problem in our sedentary society is that we don't get the opportunity to use our muscles so that we rush off and do things, because the stresses that we experience are often mental stresses rather than physical stresses. Trouble with the boss, for example. Emotional trouble at home. They are not things that you can run away from physically or fight physically. Therefore, the adrenaline stays with you. And because the adrenaline stays with you, the muscles are still tensed up, and the brain is still hyper-alert, and you're ready to snap, and you can't sleep. If that happens for a long time, you then get another hormone coming in called cortisol, which perpetuates the level of stress and causes all sorts of other things to happen, including things like the rise in blood pressure that you can have. If you can get rid of the effects of stress by getting rid of the adrenaline, then you may find you can counter this at a physical level. So if you can exercise daily, as well as being very good for your cardiovascular system at a general point of view, it's actually a very good anti-stress measure. And exercise is very good because it releases endorphins, which, if you remember, are the body's morphine, which gives you a nice boost, makes you all nice and relaxed, and makes you feel a lot better. So exercise is good for you, and it gets rid of the stress for a number of different reasons. Avoid too much coffee, tea, and cola drinks. They've got caffeine in. Caffeine makes people a little bit too alert, and then your mind can be over-buzzing. Often people who have problems with sleeping are actually drinking an awful lot more coffee or tea than they think. Don't be fooled. Tea has got lots of caffeine in. Coffee's just got more. 1 cup of coffee is approximately the equivalent of 2 cups of tea, as far as caffeine is concerned. We were talking earlier about sleeplessness in people who were depressed. One of the problems that I didn't mention at the time was that you can get people who are depressed who can't get off to sleep, and that can be a direct result of the depression. But it can also be very involved with the fact that sometimes people are taking coffee, tea, or cola drinks as a pick-me-up to make themselves feel a little bit better. But the downside of it is that they're then giving themselves too much caffeine and they're making themselves agitated. Have a hobby. Be an individual. God made man in his own image. God is a creator. Therefore, man is a creator as well. If we do not create, then we are less than the image of God than God would have us be. Being creative is part of being human. It is a God-given attribute. It doesn't matter what that creativity is. Okay, I can't paint like Van Gogh, but it's quite fun to slap stuff on a canvas. And it expresses me and how I feel. Art isn't actually my particular great interest. My great interest is actually music. And I love writing music and listening to it. Okay, I'm not Beethoven, but I enjoy what I do, and it's me, and it's creative, and it's part of being what God wanted me to be, a creative person. Have a hobby. Do things. Doesn't matter what. Doesn't have to be Christian. We do have this horrible tendency to make everything into a sort of, you've got to do it in a Christian fashion. Join your amateur dramatic society. Make your surroundings peaceful. That's important. This is all about feeding yourself. We so often feed other people, we forget to feed ourselves sometimes. This goes back to Jesus, knowing that there is need all around and going away to be quiet on his own, pray, be with God, and probably just have a rest as well. These things are important. Spoil yourself from time to time. How many people in the Protestant church, do you think, have a sort of mental equivalent of sackcloth and ashes and hair shirts? But in our actual actions, often we treat it as though we've got to earn our own salvation and that we shouldn't deserve, we can't have something because we didn't deserve it, because we haven't done enough. And that can get into particularly if you're into the perfectionist mould, can get to the stage where you never ever give yourself any treats at all simply because you don't think you're good enough to deserve any treats. Well, we didn't deserve to get forgiven, did we? But God still gave it us. Hallelujah. So if God thinks that much about us, please let us not disrespect ourselves and hate the person that he loves. We need looking after. We need sometimes just to spoil ourselves a bit. Know where you're going. Be at peace with God, obviously. But there are levels at which people can be at peace with God. It can be very stressful being a Christian, but if you know that you're doing the right thing and if you know that God is calling you, then that of itself can reduce the levels of stress that you experience. Don't take your worries to bed. Learn to let go and let God, as people have said. And learn to forgive yourself. God has. Who are you to object? You've got to let yourself be forgiven by yourself. It's so easy to have very, very high standards and then kick yourself furiously when you don't meet those standards. God doesn't look on people like that. He loves us. He never gives us things that we can't cope with. He may give us some tough things, but he's not going to give us things that we can't cope with. And he does understand when things go wrong and we do things that perhaps we shouldn't do. And the person, as on our diagram about the shopaholism, when the person with the rotten marriage ends up an alcoholic, I don't think God turns around to him and says, "You little worm, look at that, the amount you drank." He may say, "I do understand, and I do love you, you know. I'd rather you didn't have the problems that are within your marriage. Maybe you contributed to them, but I love you, even when you're drunk. I love you as you are." Let's go and talk a little bit about time management. Don't work unnecessarily against the clock. Some people aren't very good at time management. Interestingly, there are lots of different personality types, and some people are very good at having a little clock in their head. It depends, this is genetically determined. Some people have a clock in their head and they know exactly what the time is. Some other people, about the other 50%, don't have that same clock. And to the one sort, 5 minutes is 5 times 1 minute. To the other sort, 5 minutes is somewhere between a minute and an hour. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we're different, just as some people are blonde and some people are brunette. Concentrate on this moment. Sort out your priorities and distinguish the important from the urgent. Concentrating on this moment is very important. It's very biblical too. Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow can take care of itself. You can't affect the past. You can affect the future. But you only affect the future by what you do now. Okay, that doesn't mean you can't plan, but you don't worry about it for tomorrow. You just do what you have to do today. Sort out your priorities. Distinguish. Do you know the difference between the important and the urgent? I bet you probably half the people in this room don't really know and don't feel it in their heart. What's the difference? Something is urgent if it has to be done now, but you don't necessarily have to do it. That's the important thing. So something which is important and urgent might be making sure you caught the last train, because there isn't another one. Okay? Something which is urgent but not important, catching the next to last train. Okay, you've got to do it now if you're going to do it, but it isn't actually important because there's always one coming behind. Catching the news on the hour is not important, though it may be urgent in the sense that if you turn on the radio at 5 minutes past, you've missed it. You can have things that are important and not urgent, like choosing whom to get married to. And you can have things that are not important and not urgent. Fill in your own blank. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it, because not important and not urgent could be just going off and having a swim, which might be a nice way to spend the afternoon. Doesn't mean you can't do it because it's not important. Doesn't mean you can't do it because it's not urgent. So just because something falls in the not important, not urgent category isn't of real great importance. Have I used the word right? No, probably not. It doesn't matter that much because you can still do it. The important thing is to do those things that are urgent and important straight away, because they won't wait, and concentrate as far as you can on making sure that the important but not urgent things follow on behind as the time is available. Avoid multitasking if you're stressed. It's so easy to juggle things. There's actually a physiological difference between men and women in this. Women can do it to some extent, but only if they have already had children. It's true. Men can't. There is a difference between men's and women's brains. Women's brains are like a floodlight. Men's brains are like a searchlight. Okay? Women can take in things. This is why they know instinctively where the butter is in the fridge, and I can't find it. All right? But multitasking, when you're trying to juggle too much at the same time, doesn't work usually in stress. And in fact, women can do it because they have had the business of trying to make the food at the same time as changing the nappy, at the same time as pulling little Noel up from where he might be into difficulties doing, you know, all that sort of stuff. And you're trying to do 6 things at once. You do learn a little bit of multitasking, but it's actually stressful and it's best to avoid it if you can. You need time for silence and thinking, and that is not the same as having a quiet time. It's very easy to do this disciplined sort of, oh yes, I'm going to be a Christian, I'm going to have my quiet time. That is not the same as resting. That is active work. Have a day of rest each week, positive rest. To the Jew, the Sabbath is a day of celebration. When they don't work, they don't have to work. Very interesting point about the Sabbath. I've already said that really the Bible says about the Sabbath, 6 days shalt thou work, and on the 7th thou shalt have a bean feast. And it's very, very true. The Sabbath was made for man, said Jesus, not man for the Sabbath. How humble of God. How silly and how arrogant of us if we do it the other way round and say, oh, well, never mind the fact that you've given us 1 day out in 7. We're not going to use it the way you want. We're going to pray and we're going to have lots of services and we're not going to enjoy our families and we're not going to go out and play football under any circumstances. It's not a good idea to play something physical on a Sunday. And we are going to abuse your Sabbath for you. That's not what God said it was about. God said it was about enjoying yourself. Interesting. He said 6 days shalt thou labour. We only do 5. I suspect, actually, that we'd have a much easier time of working out what to do on a Sunday if we all worked 6 days a week, instead of working, as many people do when they're in industry, just the 5. Because then they've got the day off, the day of rest, which is the Saturday, which they know how to deal with, because they just go and watch the football or the cricket or wash the car or something like that. And then they don't quite know what to do with Sunday. So I think that's quite a useful point to make. Stress at work, bad working conditions, interpersonal office problems. Everybody knows of this sort of thing. It's a stress if you've got too much to do. It does help if you're trying to get off to a good start in the mornings. because otherwise you end up perpetually 10 minutes late for everything, and that really just self-stresses within you. And the more you self-stress within you, the worse it gets. And then you hate yourself for being late and not doing well, and then it affects the way you do the whole day, so you don't work as well. You're back to this little circle of the vicious cycle of stress again, aren't we? Try not to mix your home and work life. I know it's not easy to do that, and it's particularly difficult for young mums who are also out at work. Take holidays. Some people are not good at taking holidays. Some people are really not good at giving themselves rest, recreation, and holidays. And I'm one of them. I'm not good at it. I know I'm not good at it. Get organised. Organisation is a very helpful thing if you are stressed. I'm very much into computers. I discovered a wonderful program called InfoSelect, which is a free-form database that you just type things in and you just sort of shove it into the computer and it files it for you, and then you can find anything you want and it files it very, very quickly. And in doing so, I reorganised my life and I emptied a filing cabinet in the process because everything got scanned onto it. And now I can find anything I want, and its addresses and recipes and what colour bricks we used for which bit of the house and what colour paint we used and things like that. And I can find it, and I haven't got this mountain of paper. Wonderful. That may not be the way that you want to go about doing it. You may hate computers, but all that I'm saying is you get organised in the way that I got organised, and you find that the stresses decrease. Don't panic. And being organised is how you get rid of panic. Do you remember Mr. Micawber? Total annual income, £20. Total annual expenditure, £19.19 and sixpence. Result, happiness. Total income, £20. Total expenditure, £20 and sixpence. Result, misery. From which we conclude that the difference between happiness and misery is a shilling. Actually, it's less than that. It's a halfpenny. It's the difference between £19, 1911 3 farthings, and £20 and a farthing in Dickens' time. From which we can conclude that the difference between success and failure, stress and non-stress, can be a fraction of a % of the total. And if you can just deal with a fraction of that little percent, you can bring your whole life back into balance again. And I have a way of saying this. I call it shaving time. Think about Sean Connery and you'll understand. Shaving time. Okay? You can save time by shaving time. Just taking a very small amount off any activity, particularly if that activity is repeated, will save you a large amount of time in the long run and may bring you back into emotional balance. Let me give you an example of this. In our surgery, we have a thing called the JX board. This is one of these red-coloured boards that you have over the reception area that call in the name of the patient. Mrs. Williams, please go into Dr. Lockley in room 7, that sort of stuff. And you may look at it and think, that doesn't help anybody very much. And the patients will come in and say, oh, I'd love to see my name up in lights, doctor. And they may look at it and think, well, this is, a very expensive waste of money. Why are we doing it? We worked out that if we did it the other way, which was buzzing to the receptionist to say, I'm ready, would you send the next patient in? Ended up with the receptionist sitting there thinking, I'm on the wrong bit of the computer. Hang on a minute, I'm trying to make an appointment with somebody else. I'm on the phone. Wait a minute, I'll just deal with this. Yeah, okay, fine. Now, what was it? Yeah, Mrs. Williams, would you come in? All that took, on average, about 20 seconds. Okay, so we save 20 seconds each time we send a patient in. Okay, that doesn't sound much, does it? Only I see about 17 patients a surgery twice a day. And multiply that by the number of days in the week, and that 20 seconds saves me an hour each week. You do the sums. An hour. Now, if you say to most doctors, I can give you an hour spare, oh, thank goodness. We did it just by that simple technique of shaving time. You can do it in any area that you have problems with if you just think about it. All you have to do is shave a very small percentage, and then Mr. Micawber's dictum comes true. You shave time. Finally, let's talk about what happens when stress gets taken to the extreme: burnout. Burnout is three things. It's emotional exhaustion, tiredness, irritability, accident proneness, and depression. It's depersonalization. That's when you treat people as though they were objects. And usually it's accompanied by poor productivity, together with feelings of low achievement. Burnout is surprisingly selective. It occurs in high-pressure situations where there are immense emotional and social responsibilities, where there's little job variety. People who burn out are often emotionally isolated, and church workers are especially vulnerable, particularly the ministry. They are isolated because they are on a pedestal, not necessarily their own pedestal, but other people have put it on. Oh, we couldn't do that. No, that's the job of the minister. Oh, no, it's the vicar. No, the vicar must do that. And the minister may find that he is stressed beyond belief by that. People who burn out are often emotionally isolated. You're emotionally isolated if you're in a position of leadership, like a vicar, or a minister, or a pastoral leader. High-pressure situations, well, life and death is pretty high pressure. Ministers, doctors, nurses, immense emotional and social responsibilities, similar sort of pattern, social workers. Burnout is surprisingly selective. You can be a history teacher in a school and be burned out, and then become a math teacher. Or you can become a history researcher. It's just that one little area that you can't do, that you're burned out in. That's why it is called burnout, very much like the burning out of an electrical circuit. The rest of the circuit's fine. It's just a little bit in one strand that's gone wrong. And the cure for burnout is to recognise the area that's gone wrong and try to go somewhere else. So change jobs or working practices. So the history teacher who becomes the history researcher, or the history teacher who becomes the maths teacher. Just a little change like that can make a lot of difference. Get rest. I've been talking about rest a lot, haven't I? Absence from work is sometimes necessary. Time off to get yourself back together. Avoid excess stress. Learn what really is the big problem, what the stresses are. Try and control it. Emphasise the team approach and share emotional responsibility. And that's it. Thank you.